The cabin was gone before the first stars sharpened overhead. Flames had taken the logs Silas had hewn himself the roof he'd patched last spring, the narrow bed where he'd coughed his last. Vesper Hale stood barefoot in the scorched grass nightgown, singed at the hem, the only thing left in her fist, a dented tin locket warm from the fire. Inside it, Silas smiled the way he used to before the sickness hollowed his cheeks. She did not cry. Tears would have steamed on her face. The prairie wind shifted, carrying dust, and the faint iron scent of blood long dried. Then came the hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, not the wild gallop of raiders in a hurry. Shadows separated from the dark beyond the dying glow. 6, maybe 7 riders. Their horses blew soft nostrils wide, sensing smoke and fear. No war cries. Only the creak of leather, the faint clink of metal on metal, and the low snort of a paint stallion. They formed a loose half-circle. Firelight slid across lance tips, across the eagle feathers, braided into black hair, across ritual scars that told stories she would never read. The tallest man dismounted without hurry. Broad shoulders under a war shirt heavy with beadwork. His face bore the marks of battles survived, jaw-scarred eyes, reflecting orange like polished obsidian. He carried a knife in his right-hand blade, worn smooth from use grip, steady as a man who had long ago made peace with what it could do. Vesper felt her heartbeat in her throat, steady, not frantic. She had buried Silas with her own hands. She had kept breathing when every dawn felt like a betrayal. If this was the end, she would meet it standing. The man stepped closer. Close enough she smelled horse, sweat, sage, sun-baked hide. The knife rose, slow, deliberate. Time thickened. She saw the faint copper bands on his arms, the measured rise of his chest, the way his eyes searched hers, not with hate, but with something colder recognition of another creature that refused to break easily. She spoke before the blade could finish its arc. "If death is waiting," she said, voice low but clear, "let your kiss come first." The words hung between them like smoke that would not rise. The knife stopped. His eyes widened a fraction, the first crack in the mask. Behind him the riders went still. Even the horses stilled. Only the fire snapped, and somewhere far off a coyote yipped once and fell silent. He studied her face as though reading tracks in dust. The knife lowered until the point rested against his thigh. His free hand lifted, hovered near her soot-streaked cheek, close enough she felt the heat of his palm, but he did not touch. A single word left his mouth soft in Apache. Unreadable. One of the younger riders spoke sharp. Laughter followed short and hard. The leader answered without turning voice, flat with authority. Argument flared, quick exchanges of sound and posture. Some tones carried scorn, others uncertainty. Through it all, his gaze never left her. In the fading light, she thought she saw something shift in those eyes. Not pity. Respect, perhaps. The kind given to something that refuses the easy path. The dispute ended with a single command. He sheathed the knife with care, motioned to a rider. Rawhide appeared. Vesper extended her wrists without being asked. The young man bound her firm, not cruel, avoiding her eyes. When it was done, the leader gestured toward his paint stallion. She looked back once. The embers of everything she and Silas had built glowed faintly against the night. The locket pressed against her breastbone beneath torn cloth, the last tether to a life already ash on the wind. He mounted first, then reached down. His grip at her waist was sure, unhurried. She settled behind him, bound hands, making balance a constant fight. His war shirt scratched her cheek. Beneath it she felt the coiled readiness of a man shaped by a land that forgave nothing. The riders turned into the dark. Rain scented the air too late for the cabin, perhaps not too late for whatever lay ahead. They rode into the wide Texas night, leaving the ashes behind toward a fate measured not in miles, but in the silence that followed her words. The second day broke hot and dry, the sun, already a hammer by mid-morning. Vesper's thighs chafed raw against the saddle blanket, wrists burned where rawhide had tightened overnight. She rode behind Thorn Calder, forced to lean into the hard plane of his back whenever the paint stallion shifted gait. His war shirt smelled of smoke and horse, and something sharper, sage maybe, or the open land itself. She kept her eyes down, counting the rhythm of hooves on parched earth, trying not to think how far the cabin's ashes already lay behind. They stopped at a thin creek that barely deserved the name. Water ran clear over flat stones, barely deep enough to wet a horse's fetlocks. The riders dismounted without words. Thorn swung down first, then reached up and lifted her off with the same unhurried strength he'd used the night before. Her legs buckled the instant her feet touched ground. She caught herself against the stallion's shoulder, breath hissing through clenched teeth. No one helped her stand. No one needed to. Draven stayed mounted a moment longer than the rest. He watched her with the idle contempt of a man who had seen captives before, most of them, begging most of them broken. His gaze settled on the locket, still hanging against her chest, silver catching the sun. He said something short in Apache, lips curling. The others glanced over, then away. Thorn did not look up from watering his horse, but his shoulders tightened a fraction. Vesper felt the weight of eyes like heat on skin. She straightened slowly, refusing to cover the locket with her bound hands. Silas's face was inside faded, smiling the way he had when they first staked the claim. She had not opened it since the fire. Opening it now would feel like letting him see this, her wrists raw, her nightgown torn to rags, riding behind a man who could end her with a flick of the knife at his belt. Thorn turned then. He stepped close enough she smelled the faint sweat on him, the dust in his hair. Without asking, he reached for the locket. His fingers brushed the chain. She stiffened. For a heartbeat, she thought to pull away. Instead, she lifted her chin, met his eyes. They were dark, unreadable, but not cruel. He tugged once. The chain gave. The locket came free into his palm. Vesper's breath caught not from fear, but from the sudden hollow where the metal had rested against her skin all these months. Thorn turned the locket over thumb, tracing the dented edge, then flicked it open. Silas looked up at him from the tiny oval frame. Draven laughed again, low and hard. Thorn did not. He studied the photograph a long moment, then closed the lid with deliberate care. When he spoke, the English came rough-shaped by a mouth more used to Apache. Dead stays dead. The words landed like stones in still water. Vesper felt them settle in her chest. She wanted to snatch the locket back to explain that Silas was not some ghost to fear, only a man who had loved her and died too soon. But the air between them had thickened. She saw the way Thorn's jaw set, the way Draven's eyes narrowed. Names of the dead carried weight here, she felt it without being told. Speaking Silas aloud might call something worse than memory. Thorn pressed the locket back into her palm. His fingers closed hers around it, held 1 second longer than necessary. Long enough she felt the callus on his thumb, the warmth of skin that had known sun and blade and blood. Then he released her. He turned away, remounted without another word. The others followed. Vesper stood a moment alone by the creek water, gurgling past her bare feet, locket heavy in her fist again. She slipped the chain over her head, felt the metal settle against her skin like a promise she could no longer keep entirely her own. When she mounted behind Thorn, the paint stallion shifted under their combined weight. Draven rode close enough that his knee brushed hers. He did not speak, but his stare lingered doubtful, measuring, as though he had just seen something he did not like. The riders moved on. The prairie rolled ahead, endless and indifferent. Behind them the sun climbed higher, burning shadows short. Ahead the faint haze of smoke rose from distant teepees. The village was near, and whatever law she had brushed against by carrying a dead man's face into their country had already begun to tighten. The village appeared at the edge of the world as the sun bled low, painting the teepees in dull copper and long shadow. Smoke rose thin and straight from cook fires, carrying the smell of roasting meat and mesquite, sharp familiar in a way that made Vesper's stomach twist. She had smelled campfires before, but never like this, not wood alone, but wood and hide, and the faint metallic bite of worked stone. Thorn dismounted first. His boots hit the packed earth without sound. He reached for her waist again, the same sure grip, and set her down. Her legs folded almost at once. She caught herself on his arm before she could fall. He did not pull away, but neither did he hold longer than necessary. The raw hide still bit her wrists. She straightened slowly, chin up, refusing to look small. They led her forward between the rows of lodges. Children paused their games, sticks clattering to the dirt, eyes wide and dark. Women stopped scraping hides, bone awls frozen mid-stroke. Men rose from where they sat, sharpening blades or repairing bows, faces hardening into something between curiosity and warning. No shouts, no rush, only the slow closing of bodies, the soft shuffle of moccasins on earth. Chief Bram waited at the center staff, planted like a root. He was old enough that the years had carved deep lines around his eyes, yet his back remained straight. Thorn positioned Vesper a few paces before him, then stepped to the side, close enough to claim her, far enough to show he did not own her yet. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of a nearby fire and the distant whinny of a horse. Maris moved first. She stepped from the crowd, heavy braid, swinging eyes fixed on Vesper like a blade finding its mark. She pointed once, finger steady, and spoke in rapid Apache words Vesper could not understand, but felt in the marrow. A younger woman Elowen translated quietly, voice low, reluctant. She says the white woman carries the smell of death. She will foul the water. She will drive the game away. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled outward, soft as wind through grass. Vesper felt the shift the first glances had been measuring. Now they were weighing. She kept her eyes forward on the horizon beyond the teepees, but she saw the children edge back toward their mothers, saw the women fold their arms tighter across their chests. Thorn spoke then one short sentence. Elowen did not translate it, but the tone carried authority. He gestured toward his own lodge a few paces away, larger than most, its door flap painted with faint horse tracks. He meant to place her there under his roof, under his protection. The gesture was small, but it landed like a stone in still water. Draven's jaw tightened. He looked at Thorn, then at Vesper, then back to Thorn. Maris's hand closed on her husband's arm, hard enough the knuckles showed white. No words passed between them, but the message was plain. By claiming her, even this far, Thorn had begun to risk something older than himself. Vesper felt the pull in her chest. Out on the prairie edge, trussed and left for the night, she would be exposed, easy prey for any who decided the law demanded her gone. Closer to Thorn's fire, she would be safer from the cold and the dark, but every eye would see her as something more dangerous, the woman he had chosen to shield. A captive Da Trang under a warrior's roof carried its own violation of unspoken law. She met Thorn's gaze for the first time since the creek. He did not ask. He waited. Chief Bram lifted his staff once struck the ground. Dust rose in a small puff. She must prove her heart, Elowin whispered, translating the old man's words. Or she leaves this place in the way the land decides. Thorn gave a single nod, small final. Draven stepped forward, then close enough Vesper smelled the anger on him, like sweat and dust. He leaned toward Maris' voice, a low rasp only she and Thorn could hear. Maris's eyes never left Vesper's face. The circle held its breath. No one moved. The fire popped once, sending a spark upward into the gathering dark. Vesper stood between them, all wrists still bound, the locket warm against her skin. She understood now, without words, her presence had already drawn a line through the camp. Thorn's honor, Draven's blood, the old laws that kept them alive, everything balanced on what came next. And the next thing would not be gentle. The fire in the central ring burned low and steady, fed by dry mesquite that popped like distant gunshots. Shadows stretched long across the packed earth, flickering over the faces of the gathered people. Vesper stood in the middle of the circle, wrists finally free of rawhide, but hands still stiff and swollen. The night air carried the bite of cooling sand and the faint copper tang of her own blood from the ride's scrapes. Her nightgown hung in rags. Someone had draped a thin blanket across her shoulders earlier, but it had slipped to the ground. She did not bend to pick it up. Chief Bram struck his staff once against the dirt. The sound cut through the murmurs. He spoke in Apache voice, low and final. Elowin, standing near the edge, translated just loud enough for Vesper to hear. "Prove your heart, or the land will decide." Zinnia stepped forward from the ring of bodies, tall, broad through the shoulders, arms corded from years of scraping hides and hauling water. Her hair was pulled tight, face painted with simple ochre lines that caught the firelight. She carried no weapon, only the weight of expectation. The women around her straightened. This was their ground, their honor at stake. Vesper's pulse hammered in her ears. She glanced once at Thorn. He stood apart, arms folded, face unreadable in the shifting light. No encouragement, no warning, only the steady rise and fall of his chest. She looked away before the fear could root deeper. Zinnia moved without flourish. One step, then a fist drove into Vesper's stomach, hard, fast, no wind-up. Air exploded from her lungs. She folded knees, buckling tasted iron as her lip split against teeth. The ground rushed up. She caught herself on palms and elbows, gravel biting skin. The circle exhaled a single collective breath. She stayed down a heartbeat. Long enough to feel the ache bloom across her ribs, long enough to hear Draven's low mutter to Maris. Long enough to remember Silas's grave dug with blistered hands in frozen earth. Long enough to know lying there would be easier. Vesper pushed up. First to knees, then to feet. The blanket stayed on the ground. Blood trickled from her mouth, warm on her chin. Zinnia weighted fists loose, but ready eyes measuring not cruel, only certain. The second blow came from the side, a backhand across the cheek. Vesper's head snapped. Light burst behind her eyes. She staggered, tasted more blood, felt the sting spread like fire across bone. Again she went down harder this time, dirt grinding into palms. The circle was silent now. No cheers, no jeers. Only the crackle of the fire and the soft shuffle of feet as people shifted weight. Vesper planted her hands. Pushed, stood, swayed. Her left eye was swelling shut, already vision narrowing to a slit. She raised her fists awkward, untrained, trembling, but raised them. Zinnia circled, once slow, then lunged. Arm locked around Vesper's waist drove her backward into the dirt. The impact jarred teeth together. Ribs screamed. Vesper tasted blood thicker, now felt it pool under her tongue. Zinnia, released, stepped back. Vesper rolled to her side, spat red into the dust, pushed again. Knees shook, arms shook, everything shook. But she rose third time slower, blood dripping in dark drops that soaked the earth. Zinnia stopped, fists lowered. She studied Vesper the way one studies a track that refuses to fade. A single word left her mouth quiet. Elowen's voice came soft from the edge. She says, "She has heart." The circle held its breath. No one moved. The fire snapped once, sending sparks upward into the dark. Zinnia turned away, spine-straight pride intact. Draven's face darkened. He looked at Thorn, then at Vesper, then back to his wife. Maris's eyes stayed on Vesper, cold, sharp, unblinking. Thorn did not speak. He only watched as Vesper swayed on her feet, blood streaking her chin blanket forgotten at her heels. The fire burned lower. The night pressed in, and the next proof would come soon, whether the camp could bear what she had just shown, or whether it would demand more blood to wash it clean. The morning sun rose pale through thin clouds, the air still carrying the chill of night. Vesper sat cross-legged on a spread hide near the women's working area, the blanket from last night wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her face throbbed, left eye, half-closed lip crusted with dried blood, but the real ache lived in her hands. Knuckles, swollen palms, scraped raw from the dirt of the fight. The bone awl felt foreign in her grip, its point blunt from long use, the softened hide stiff under her fingers. Around her the women worked without pause. Hides stretched on frames, beads sorted into shallow bowls of woven yucca. The rhythmic scratch of awls and the soft clink of bone needles filled the space between fires. No one spoke to her directly. Eyes flicked her way, then away, quick assessing. Elowen knelt beside her close, but not touching. She demonstrated once, pierce, pull, thread through, set the bead with a twist of the wrist. Simple. Precise. She placed the awl in Vesper's palm and stepped back. Vesper hesitated. The awl slipped once, pricking skin. A bead rolled free and vanished into the dust. She exhaled slowly, reached for another. Her stitches came crooked at first, too loose, too tight thread tangling like her thoughts. She kept her head down, watching the others from the corner of her good eye. Maris sat a few paces off, scraping a fresh hide with deliberate strokes. She paused, blade still, and looked over. Her gaze settled on Vesper's work. A low murmur passed between her and two other women. They did not laugh, but the sound carried weight, doubt, impatience. Vesper felt it settle in her chest like dust after a wind. She tried again. The bead slipped. Maris rose without hurry, crossed the short distance, and took the piece from Vesper's hands. She held it up to the light, turned it once, then tore the thread with a quick jerk. The hide split along the seam. She dropped the ruined fragment at Vesper's knees and returned to her place without a word. The other women resumed their rhythm. Vesper stared at the torn hide a long moment. Her fingers trembled not from pain, but from the quiet certainty that every mistake here was not just failure, but proof she consumed what the land could not spare. The creek was low this season, the buffalo trails thinner. A useless mouth meant less for the children, less for the horses, less for tomorrow. Elowen leaned in, voice barely above breath. Again. Vesper picked up the awl. She started over. The sun climbed. Sweat stung the cuts on her face. Her hands cramped, but she forced them steady. Stitch by stitch, the pattern emerged, not beautiful, not even but finished. a small rectangle of hide, 3 crooked rows of beads. She set it down. No one spoke. Zinnia approached, then slow, deliberate. She lifted the piece, turned it in calloused fingers, held it to the light. Long silence. The women around them stilled. Chief Bram watched from the shade of a nearby lodge staff, planted face shadowed. Zinnia placed the work back in Vesper's lap. No nod, no smile, only the faint release of breath through her nose. Maris turned away, shoulders rigid. A boy small, no more than 7, edged closer from the side. Flint. He peered at the beaded hide eyes, wide with unguarded curiosity, then glanced up at Vesper. His mother's hand appeared gentle, but firm, pulling him back. He resisted a second, then went. The women returned to their tasks. The awls resumed their scratch. The wind moved through the teepees, carrying the smell of drying meat and distant rain that might never come. Vesper closed her fingers around the small piece. It was hers now, ugly, hard-won, a mark on the land she had not yet earned, and the next test weighted heavier than the one before. The earth beneath her was already choosing sides. The storm came without warning, the way the plains always delivered what they owed. One moment the sky was slate gray and still. The next wind tore at the teepees, whipping dust into eyes and mouths. Rain followed in sheets, cold, driving, turning the ground to slick mud in minutes. Vesper was inside Thorne's lodge, folding the blanket she had been given, when the first scream cut through the howl. She stepped to the door flap. Outside, chaos moved in slow motion, women pulling children, close men, running toward the creek that had been a trickle that morning. The water had risen fast brown and furious, carrying branches and foam. A small figure, Flint, thrashed near the far bank arms, flailing, then vanishing under the current. Vesper did not think. She dropped the blanket and ran. Bare feet slapped wet earth, then sucked mud. Rain stung her face, soaked the thin dress she had been given. She reached the bank ahead of the others, saw the boy, swept past again, limp now face down. The creek bent sharp ahead. A fallen cottonwood jutted into the flow roots, clawing the air. She jumped. Water hit like iron, cold enough to lock lungs, strong enough to drag. She kicked hard arms, cutting through the brown rush. The current pulled. She fought it, lungs burning. Flint's shirt brushed her fingers once, twice. Then she closed her hand on fabric, yanked him against her chest. His weight dragged them both under. She kicked again, lungs screaming, vision narrowing to black spots. The cottonwood loomed. She twisted, used its trunk to break the pull. They tumbled into the eddy behind it, slower water, shallower. Her feet found mud. She hauled Flint onto the bank, rolled him face down, struck his back once, twice, hard, desperate. Water poured from his mouth. A cough. A thin wail. Hands appeared, strong ones, lifting them both. Thorne. His face was carved from stone, breath ragged. He set Vesper on her feet. She swayed, ribs aching where rocks had struck, blood mixing with rain on her arm. Junia Vale ran up skirts heavy with mud and dropped to her knees beside Flint. She gathered him close, rocking, murmuring words too soft to carry. Tears cut clean tracks down her cheeks. Vesper stood dripping, chest heaving. The rain lessened to a steady fall. People gathered, silent, soaked, watching. Chief Bram approached last staff, sinking into the mud with each step. He stopped a pace away. No words, only the steady regard of old eyes that had seen too many seasons end. Thorne's hand rested once on Vesper's shoulder, brief firm, then fell away. He looked at Bram. The old man looked back. Between them passed something wordless, heavy as the water still rushing past. Vesper felt it settle in her bones. She had touched Apache blood with her own hands. Not to harm. To save! The law forbade it, as surely as it forbade naming the dead. No ceremony could wash that away. No offering could undo what the creek had witnessed. Draven stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, face dark. Maris beside him, eyes fixed on Vesper, not with hate now, but with something colder calculation. The boy lived. The white woman had made him live. Chief Bram turned away, first staff pulling free of the mud with a wet suck. The others followed slow without hurry. Vesper remained by the bank a moment longer. Rain dripped from her hair. Flint's thin cry faded into his mother's arms. Thorn waited a few paces off, silent. The creek kept running brown and unconcerned, and the camp had seen what could not be unseen. Now the land itself would demand an answer, keep her, or lose what the water had spared. The lodge smelled of cedar smoke and wet hide, the small central fire casting low orange light across painted horse figures on the walls. Rain still tapped the canvas overhead, softer now, like fingers drumming patience. Vesper sat on a folded robe, knees drawn up, the borrowed dress clinging cold to her skin. Her arm throbbed where the creek had thrown her against stone. Blood had crusted dark along the cut. Thorn knelt before her, unwrapping a strip of soft buckskin from his pouch. He worked without hurry, dipped a cloth in a shallow bowl of water, scented with sage, pressed it to the wound. His touch was careful, almost absent, as though tending a horse's scraped leg. She did not flinch. She watched his hands instead, the faint scars across knuckles, the steady rhythm of breath through his nose. The silence between them was thick, not empty. Every few moments his eyes lifted to hers, held then returned to the task. The door flap stirred. Grandmother Vesper stepped inside without announcement. She was small, bent by years, yet the weight of her presence filled the lodge like smoke. She stood just inside the opening, staff-planted face half-shadowed. She said nothing at first, only watched. Thorn finished binding the cut. He sat back on his heels, hands resting loose on thighs. Grandmother Vesper spoke, then Apache low and measured. Elowen, who had followed quietly, translated from the doorway. My grandmother was white once, taken young. She fought. Every day she fought until she did not. She became New Moon, bore sons, strong sons. The old woman's eyes never left Vesper. When her man was gone and the sons grown, she told me she never stopped being both. White woman. New Moon. The heart can hold two worlds if it is strong enough. Vesper felt the words settle heavy in her chest. She looked down at the fresh bandage white against bruised skin. Then up at Thorn. He had not moved. His face gave nothing away, but the firelight caught the faint line of tension along his jaw. Grandmother Vesper's gaze shifted to the locket at Vesper's throat. Thorn followed it. He reached, slowly, hesitated, then touched the chain with one finger. Not pulling, asking. Vesper's hand rose instinctively to cover it. Silas's face waited inside, faded, smiling. She had carried him through fire, through the ride, through the fight, through the water. Letting go now would be like burying him again. She drew breath. His name was Silas Crow. My husband. Consumption took him 3 months before the fire. The words came quiet, careful. He built the cabin with his hands. He died in it. I buried him behind it. Grandmother Vesper's head moved a small, almost imperceptible shake. Not anger. Warning. Elowen's voice faltered on the translation. Naming the dead aloud here carried its own risk, like calling a spirit back when it should stay gone. Thorn's finger lingered on the chain a second longer, then withdrew. He looked at his grandmother. She met his eyes, then Vesper's again, measured, weighing. She spoke once more. Eloin translated softly. The heart must choose one name. Grandmother Vesper turned. The flap fell behind her. Outside, the rain had eased to a steady drip from the lodge poles. Draven's silhouette appeared briefly against the glow of a distant fire, close enough to have heard far enough to pretend he had not. Mara stood beside him, arms folded tight. Inside the lodge, the fire burned lower. Thorn rose, fed it a small stick. Sparks lifted, died. Vesper closed her fingers around the locket. Warm metal pressed into her palm. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither spoke. The silence stretched dangerous, full of things already said, and things still waiting to be chosen. The camp outside settled into night rhythms, but the line drawn by her words had not faded, and the next dawn would force the heart to name itself. The winter moon hung low, thin as a blade, scattering pale light over the central ring. Snow fell in slow, silent flakes, dusting shoulders and hair melting on warm skin before it could settle. The entire camp had gathered men, women, children, forming a wide circle around the fire that burned steady despite the cold. Smoke rose straight, carrying the sharp bite of pine resin and the faint underlying smell of damp wool and hide. Vesper walked into the center alone. No one led her. No one had to. Her steps were measured boots, borrowed from Eloin, sinking slightly into the thin crust of snow. The dress she wore, simple beaded at the hem by her own uneven hands, moved with her, the only sound the soft crunch underfoot. She stopped before Chief Bram, chin-level hands loose at her sides. The locket rested against her breastbone, heavy as stone. Thorn stood to her right, a pace away. His arms were folded, but the line of his shoulders betrayed tension muscles, coiled breath visible in short, controlled clouds. He did not look at her. He looked at the fire, at the faces around it, at nothing. Chief Bram waited. The old man's staff rested in both hands, planted firm. No one spoke. The wind moved once through the circle, lifting snow from the ground in faint swirls. Vesper drew breath. When she spoke, her voice carried clear, low, steady. Eloin translated from the edge, words falling into the silence like stones into deep water. If my being here splits the people, she said, I will walk into the prairie. Let the cold wind take me. No blood on your hands. The words hung. No one moved. Snow continued to fall soft and relentless. Draven stepped forward half a pace. His jaw worked once, twice. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Mara stood beside him, eyes wet, but she made no sound. Only the faint hitch in her breathing betrayed her. The offer had struck something deep, a white woman willing to die not for mercy, but to preserve the people's wholeness. It unsettled the oldest law they carried that outsiders took, never gave. Thorn's hand moved quick, instinctive, closing around Vesper's wrist. His fingers were warm against cold skin. He leaned close, voice, a rough whisper meant only for her. Don't. She looked at him then, met his eyes, held them. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her hand in his grip and pulled free. The motion was small, irrevocable. The words were already spoken. Before the fire, before the elders, before the ancestors whose names lived in the painted hides and the songs no one sang tonight. Once uttered, they could not be unsaid. If the council accepted, she would walk at dawn alone into the white emptiness. If they refused, they would have to name her, part of them, carry the scar of that name forever. Chief Bram regarded her a long time. Snow gathered on his shoulders, unmelted. Grandmother Vesper rose, then slow joints creaking like old wood. She leaned on her staff, voice thin but carrying. Death is the easy answer, she said. Eloin's translation came soft, almost reluctant. Living is the hard one. Live as the bridge. Bear the weight. Silence returned deeper than before. Draven lowered his head once brief the first time he had done so. Maris's hand found his arm fingers tight. No one cheered. No one spoke. The fire snapped once, sending a spark upward into the falling snow. Vesper stood still. The locket pressed against her skin, warm from her body. Thorn remained beside her, unmoving eyes fixed on the flames. The circle held. Snow fell thicker now, blanketing the ground, the shoulders, the unspoken things between them. And the dawn would come, whether to carry her away or to bind her here with a wound. No ceremony could heal. The morning came gray, and still the snow that had fallen overnight, lying thin and unbroken across the camp. The central fire pit was cold ash, now ringed by faint black char. No one had rebuilt it. The people moved, slow, deliberate women folding hides, men checking horses, children kept close. No voices rose above the ordinary sounds, the creak of lodge poles settling, the soft crunch of boots on crust, the distant snort of a horse. Chief Bram stood where he had stood the night before. His staff rested easy in both hands. When the last stragglers arrived, he struck the ground once soft final. The circle formed again, looser than before, faces shadowed by hoods and fatigue. Vesper stood beside Thorn. She had washed the blood from her face in a bowl of melted snow. The bruises had darkened overnight purple along the cheekbone lip, still split. The dress she wore carried the faint smell of wet wool and sage. Thorn's war shirt was the same one he had worn the day before. Dusty smoke stained the beadwork, catching what little light broke through the clouds. Bram spoke. Low. Measured. Elewen translated from the side voice, flat. She stays. As the woman of Thorn called her, bridge between worlds. No cheer rose. No one moved forward. The words hung in the cold air like breath, visible for a moment, then gone. Draven stood at the far edge of the circle, arms folded, gaze fixed somewhere past Vesper's shoulder. Maris beside him, face blank. They did not step closer. They did not turn away. Only the stillness between them spoke acceptance without welcome. A child broke the line, Flint's small feet kicking up snow. He ran straight to Vesper, reached up to touch her hand. His fingers brushed hers warm, quick, before Junia Vale's hand closed gently on his shoulder and drew him back. The boy looked up at his mother, then at Vesper again, confusion plain on his face. Junia murmured something soft, led him away. The space where he had stood remained empty. Thorn turned. He walked toward his lodge without hurry. Vesper followed. Inside the fire had been banked low. Embers glowed dull red under ash. He knelt, fed it small sticks until flame caught again. She stood near the door flap, watching the light play across his hands. She lifted the locket from beneath her dress. The chain had tangled slightly. She smoothed it with cold fingers, then let it fall back against her skin. Thorn glanced up. His eyes lingered on the silver oval, long enough that she felt the weight of his look. He said nothing. The fire popped once, sending a small spark upward. Outside the camp resumed its rhythm. Voices murmured low. A horse stamped. Snow continued to drift, covering tracks, softening edges. Vesper stepped to the doorway. Thorn rose, followed her out. They stood together under the gray sky, watching flakes settle on the teepees on the distant prairie that stretched empty and white. She drew breath, let it out slow. "I'm still Vesper Hale," she said quiet to him, alone. Thorn looked at her, nodded once, small, certain. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in one breath, heavy in the next. Grandmother Vesper stood far off near her own lodge, staff planted, face half turned. She watched without moving. Witness to what had been said, what had been chosen, what still remained unsaid. The snow kept falling. Soft, relentless. and the camp carried on scarred, quiet, whole in a way that would never quite mend. The prairie stretched wide and empty under a sky thick with stars, the winter moon, a thin silver crescent that gave no warmth. Snow lay thin on the ground, crunching softly under their boots as Vesper and Thorn walked away from the teepees. No fire followed them. No voices carried on the wind. Only the low moan of the breeze moving through dry grass and the faint hiss of falling flakes. They stopped at the edge of a shallow rise, far enough the camp lights were small points behind them. Vesper drew her blanket tighter against the cold that seeped through wool and hide. Thorn stood beside her, arms loose at his sides, breath fogging in slow clouds. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence was not empty. It held everything unsaid since the night she had asked for a kiss before death. Vesper lifted the locket from beneath her dress, her fingers still stiff from the cold, and the old bruises worked the clasp. The lid opened with a small click. Silas looked up from the faded oval, young, smiling the way he had when they first claimed the land before the sickness came. She studied the face a long moment, thumb tracing the edge as though memorizing it one last time. Then she closed the lid. The metal settled back against her skin, cool now, familiar. Thorn watched without moving. When she let the chain fall, he reached out, slow, deliberate, and placed his hand on her shoulder. The weight was steady, not possessive. He did not pull her closer. He did not speak. His palm carried the faint warmth of the lodge fire they had left behind, the scent of smoke clinging to his sleeve. Behind them, the camp lay quiet. A few teepees still showed faint glow through door flaps, but most had gone dark. As they had walked out earlier, some faces had turned away, subtle but unmistakable. Draven's lodge stood with its back to the path they had taken. Maris had not looked up from her work. Acceptance had come, but it carried no embrace. The people kept their wholeness by holding the line, even if the line now bent around her. Vesper looked out across the prairie. The wind stirred snow into faint drifts, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they made them. She felt the pull 2 ways back to the fire, and the people who had let her stay forward into the dark, where no one would ask her name. Staying meant carrying the scar, 2 names, 2 worlds. The quiet knowledge that some would always see her as the outsider who had been spared. Leaving meant erasing herself entirely, keeping the people's purity intact at the cost of everything she had become. Thorn's hand remained on her shoulder. He did not urge. He waited. She drew a slow breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs. Then she turned. They walked back toward the camp together side by side, footsteps soft in the snow. No words passed between them. The locket rested against her chest, a small weight she would carry always. Grandmother Vesper stood at the door of her lodge as they approached. She did not step forward. She did not speak, only watched eyes steady in the starlight as they passed into the circle of teepees. The wind rose once more, carrying the faint song of the prairie, low, endless, without beginning or end. They disappeared among the lodges. The snow kept falling, and the night closed over them, quiet, scarred, unbroken in its way. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West, stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso Legal /disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery, and drafting as part of our creative process, but every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.